What if the Middle Ages were not simply an era of confused record-keeping, of monks copying manuscripts by candlelight and occasionally getting the details wrong? What if some of the most famous figures from that long, strange millennium were not mistakes at all, but deliberate creations crafted with purpose, circulated with intent, and allowed to harden into history because the stories they told were more useful than the truth? Tonight, we open a particular drawer in the archive, one that has been sitting slightly ajar for centuries, its contents half visible to anyone willing to look. Inside, you will find popes who never existed, kings whose kingdoms were invented, outlaws who were perhaps a legal category rather than a person, and saints whose miracles outpaced their evidence by a considerable distance. You will find a medieval world that was not simply credulous, not simply naive, but in many ways extraordinarily sophisticated about the power of narrative, about what a story can do that a fact cannot. So let the light dim wherever you are. Let the weight of the day settle. Let the sounds of wherever you are become background, become texture, become the quiet hum beneath what we are about to explore. And come with me into the archive, because tonight we are not just asking whether these figures were real. We are asking something far more interesting. Why were they invented? Who needed them? And what does it tell us about the people who created them, believed them, and passed them down through centuries, that these particular stories were the ones they chose to keep? Before we go further, if you find yourself drawn to the hours when history stops making clean sense and starts revealing its stranger architecture, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are listening in the dark right now, I would genuinely love to know where you are and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments. There is something quietly remarkable about knowing that this silence, this same archive, is being visited by people across dozens of time zones, all of us drawn to the same questions in the same night hours. Now, let us begin. The medieval period, which we roughly mark from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th, is often imagined as a time of darkness, a long, unlit corridor between the classical world and modernity. That image is wrong in almost every important way, but it contains one useful truth. The medieval world was genuinely different in its relationship to evidence. Not inferior, different. Where we tend to ask first whether something is factually verifiable, medieval thinkers often asked first whether something was morally true, spiritually meaningful, or symbolically coherent. And if a story was all of those things, the question of whether it literally happened was sometimes considered secondary, sometimes almost beside the point. This is not ignorance. This is a different epistemology, a different framework for deciding what counts as real. And once you understand that, the figures we are about to examine stop looking like mistakes and start looking like something far more interesting. They look like arguments. They look like tools. They look like answers to questions that the historical record, with all its gaps and silences, was failing to provide. Consider for a moment what it meant to live inside a medieval understanding of the world. The past was not something you could access through archives and databases and digitized manuscripts. It was something you inherited through chains of testimony, through the words of those who had heard from those who had heard from those who were there, or who claimed to have been, or who had spoken to someone who claimed to have been. Verification, in the modern sense, was not simply difficult. It was often structurally impossible. You trusted the chain, you trusted the teller, you trusted the institutional authority behind the telling. And within that framework, a story repeated often enough by credible enough voices through long enough chains of transmission became something very close to fact. Not because people were foolish, but because the epistemological tools available to them made repetition itself a form of evidence. This is the world in which our invented figures were born, and it is the world that nurtured them, passed them forward, gave them the institutional weight that allowed them to persist. Understanding that world does not excuse its fabrications, but it does make them comprehensible, and comprehensible is the first step toward genuinely interesting. Let us begin with a woman who may be the most audacious invention in the history of the Catholic Church. A figure so improbable, so perfectly calibrated to cause maximum institutional embarrassment, that her very existence as a legend tells us everything about the tensions swirling through medieval Christendom. Her name, as history has given it, is Pope Joan. The story, in its fullest form, goes something like this. Sometime in the 9th century, a young woman of exceptional intelligence and ambition, born in some versions in Germany, in others in England, in still others in a location conveniently left vague, disguised herself as a man in order to pursue theological study. She was, by all accounts of the legend, genuinely brilliant, not merely competent enough to pass, but so gifted that she rose through the ecclesiastical ranks with a speed that would have been remarkable for anyone. She became a respected scholar, then a cleric. Then, through a combination of talent, circumstance, and what we might today call extraordinarily effective personal branding, she became Pope, the supreme leader of the Western Church, the vicar of Christ on earth, and for a time, according to the story, she governed. She delivered sermons. She issued theological opinions. She presided over ceremonies of enormous solemnity and weight, the kind of ceremonies that the medieval church performed with a theatrical grandeur designed to communicate divine authority through every detail of fabric and incense and choreographed movement. Nobody noticed anything unusual, which, if you pause to consider it, is either a testament to her extraordinary self-possession or a fairly pointed commentary on how carefully the medieval church actually examined its own leadership. Then comes the moment that medieval storytellers clearly savoured most. During a grand public procession through the streets of Rome, all ceremony and robes and the weight of institutional dignity, Pope Joan went into labour and gave birth in the street, in front of everyone. In some versions of the legend, she dies immediately afterward. In others, the crowd, horrified and furious at the deception, reacts with violence. In all versions, the conclusion is dramatic, public, and deeply humiliating for the institution she had managed to infiltrate. Medieval writers, it must be said, did not believe in quiet endings. Now here is where the archive opens and the real story begins to emerge, because there is no contemporary evidence that Pope Joan ever existed. Not a fragment, not a whisper, not a single line in any document written close to the period she was supposed to have reigned. The story appears in written form for the first time in the 13th century, roughly 400 years after she was supposed to have sat on the throne of St. Peter. The medieval papal records from the 9th century are, by the standards of the era, remarkably thorough. There is no missing pope. There is no unexplained gap in the succession. There is no awkward silence in the chronicle where someone clearly decided not to write something down. The absence is not suspicious. It is simply empty. The kind of emptiness that speaks not of concealment, but of non-occurrence. So the question shifts. Not did she exist, but why was she invented? And why did the invention stick? Most historians who have examined the legend carefully believe it originated as satire, or possibly as anti-papal propaganda, or perhaps as both simultaneously, since in the medieval context, those categories were not always distinct. The Church in the high medieval period was an institution of extraordinary power. It controlled enormous wealth, wielded significant political influence, and claimed a kind of moral authority that extended into nearly every corner of daily life. It crowned kings and excommunicated emperors. It decided what counted as heresy and what counted as orthodoxy. It held the keys, in its own understanding, to eternal life and eternal damnation. It was also, by consequence, an institution that attracted resentment, criticism, and a rich tradition of satirical undermining. What better way to mock an institution built on claims of divine guidance, an unbroken apostolic succession, than to suggest it had once, without noticing, elevated a woman to its highest office? The story is not merely scandalous, it is structurally perfect as a piece of anti-clerical satire. It targets the Church's pretensions to infallibility. It suggests that its vaunted hierarchy is less divinely ordered than it claims. It implies that the men running Christendom were not paying close enough attention to notice something rather fundamental about their own leader. And it does all of this with a specificity, a narrative completeness that gives it the texture of history even when it is operating as fiction. The satire is most effective precisely because it is told straight, because it does not wink. But here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because it does not stop there. Once the legend of Pope Joan entered circulation, it did not stay safely in the realm of acknowledged satire. It migrated. It was repeated by chroniclers who cited earlier chroniclers who had themselves been citing the story as established fact. It moved from the margins of polemic into the center of accepted history. Pilgrims visiting Rome were shown supposed evidence of her existence. Streets were pointed out. Locations were identified. Later church rituals were retroactively explained as safeguards instituted after the Joan scandal. Procedures designed to ensure that no future pope was anatomically surprising. The legend accumulated the barnacles of institutional response, which is one of the most reliable ways a fiction acquires the texture of history. When an institution starts defending itself against a story, the story begins to feel like something the institution has reason to fear. And a story that powerful institutions fear feels almost inevitably like truth. For centuries, educated people believed she had existed, not credulous peasants, but scholars, theologians, historians who had access to the same records that would eventually disprove the story. The confidence with which the tale was repeated was itself a kind of evidence, in a world where the chain of testimony mattered enormously, and where the idea that a story this widely told could be entirely fabricated was itself difficult to process. If everyone was repeating it, someone must have started it for a reason. And if someone started it for a reason, something must have happened. And this is the first lesson the archive offers tonight. Pope Joan never sat on the throne of St. Peter, but she absolutely dominated medieval gossip, medieval anxiety, medieval anti-clerical imagination for centuries. And in some ways, that dominion was more durable than any actual papacy. Real popes came and went, were forgotten or remembered based on the accidents of historical survival. Pope Joan, who never existed, is still being discussed, still being written about, still appearing in novels and films and late-night conversations about what the medieval church was really like. The story proved more resilient than most facts, and perhaps that is exactly what it was designed to do. Let the thought settle for a moment. A story invented to embarrass an institution ends up outlasting most of the institution's actual history in popular memory. There is something almost elegant about that, something that speaks to the particular power of a narrative that aligns with what people already suspect to be true. The medieval church was powerful and secretive, and sometimes hypocritical. Pope Joan gave that suspicion a face, a name, a dramatic public birth scene, and once a suspicion has a story, it becomes very difficult to dislodge. You can disprove a fact. You cannot quite disprove a feeling that has been given a name. If this is stirring something for you, I am curious what other invented figures or hidden histories have caught your attention, whether from the medieval world or somewhere else entirely. Leave it in the comments. The archive reads everything. Now we move from Rome to the island of Britain, from ecclesiastical satire to something even more ambitious. A figure who began as a whisper in the historical record and became the foundation of an entire cultural mythology. A king who may never have worn a crown, whose court may never have existed, whose sword was certainly never pulled from any stone, and who nonetheless became one of the most enduring symbols of national identity in the history of Western civilization. We are, of course, speaking of Arthur. The earliest references to a figure named Arthur appear in texts written centuries after the period he supposedly inhabited, roughly the 5th or 6th century, that turbulent era following the Roman withdrawal from Britain, when the island was contested between various local powers and incoming groups from the continent. These early mentions are brief, frustratingly vague. They describe a warrior, possibly a military leader, someone who fought in a series of battles against invaders. They do not describe a king. They do not describe a court. They do not describe a sword, a wizard, a round table, or a kingdom called Camelot. They describe something much more modest and much more historically plausible. A capable fighter in a chaotic time. A man whose name was worth remembering, though perhaps not yet worth embellishing. Then comes Geoffrey of Monmouth. In the 12th century, Geoffrey wrote a text he called The History of the Kings of Britain. The title is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. History implies documentation, implies research, implies a relationship to actual events. What Geoffrey produced was something considerably more creative. He described an Arthur who conquered vast territories across Europe, who defeated enemies on a scale that would have been remarkable for any medieval king, let alone a post-Roman British chieftain, who ruled with a magnificence and a moral authority that placed him among the greatest leaders in the history of the world. It was detailed, it was compelling, it was enormously popular, and by modern standards of historical evidence, it was almost entirely unreliable. Geoffrey was almost certainly drawing on a combination of genuine oral tradition, earlier fragmentary sources, and his own considerable imagination. He may have had access to materials that have since been lost. He may have been embellishing genuine memories of a real figure, or he may have been constructing something largely from whole cloth, using the texture of historical narrative to give his creation weight and credibility. We cannot know with certainty. What we can say is that the Arthur who emerges from Geoffrey's pages bears very little resemblance to anything the archaeological or documentary evidence from the actual 5th and 6th centuries can support. The excavations at sites like South Cadbury in Somerset, long proposed as a candidate for the historical Camelot, have produced evidence of a significant post-Roman fortification, but no inscription, no name, no king, only the silence of stone and the stories people have layered over it. And yet, the story spread. It was translated, adapted, expanded. French writers got hold of it and added chivalry, courtly love, the complex web of relationships between Lancelot and Guinevere, the mystical quest for the Holy Grail. With each edition, Arthur became less a historical figure and more a moral universe, a framework onto which an entire civilization could project its ideals, its anxieties, its aspirations. The court of Camelot became a kind of thought experiment about what perfect kingship might look like, what perfect loyalty might demand, what the relationship between power and virtue should ideally be. It was not a history being elaborated, it was a philosophy being built, stone by narrative stone, into something that felt like memory. And here is the genuinely remarkable thing. Arthur, who was probably at most a minor military leader whose story grew in the telling, shaped real history in ways that actual historical kings sometimes did not. English monarchs claimed descent from him or connection to his legacy. Welsh national identity drew on the tradition of his promised return, the belief that Arthur would come back in Britain's darkest hour, the once and future king waiting in some enchanted elsewhere, gave generations of people a particular kind of comfort and a particular kind of resolve. Tudor monarchs carefully cultivated Arthurian associations to legitimize their rule. Henry VII named his eldest son Arthur. The myth was not merely decorative, it was politically functional. It was doing the work of genealogy and divine right without requiring either. Consider what this implies. A figure who probably did not exist in anything like the form we imagine became a cornerstone of real political legitimacy, real national identity, real cultural self-understanding across centuries. The story did not need to be true in the ways that mattered. It needed to be resonant. It needed to speak to something people recognized about themselves, about what they hoped their civilization could be, about the kind of leadership they were willing to follow. Arthur may be historically blurry at his origins, but as a cultural instrument, he was extraordinarily precise. He was shaped, refined, and deployed with a sophistication that we tend to underestimate precisely because we are accustomed to thinking of the Middle Ages as a period when people simply believed things uncritically. The truth is more interesting. The people who built the Arthurian legend were not simply credulous. They were constructing something useful. They were building a mirror in which a culture could see its best possible self. And perhaps that is why questioning Arthur still feels, even now, slightly transgressive. Not because the evidence for his historical existence is strong. It is not, but because the myth has been doing such important cultural work for so long that dismantling it feels like dismantling something essential. The legend has become load-bearing. And that too is a kind of power that no mere fact can match. From the courts of Camelot, we move into the forests, into the green shade of Sherwood, where the light comes through in broken patterns and the sound of a bowstring is the only warning you get. We move toward a figure who may be even more elusive than Arthur, because Arthur at least has the dignity of being one invented person. The figure we are considering next may not even be that. He may be a category, a type, a label that was applied to so many different people and stories that it eventually coalesced into the illusion of a single man. Robin Hood, the noble outlaw of Sherwood Forest, the man who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, the medieval embodiment of righteous redistribution, dressed in green, armed with a longbow, surrounded by loyal companions, perpetually outwitting a corrupt sheriff who represents everything that is wrong with power when it is divorced from justice. The story is so familiar that it feels ancient. It feels like it must be rooted in something real, something documented, someone specific. And that feeling of familiarity is itself worth examining, because it is part of how legends sustain themselves. The more familiar a story feels, the more it feels like memory. And memory feels like fact. The earliest surviving ballads about Robin Hood appear in the 15th century. Centuries after the period he is most commonly associated with. And in those early ballads, he is not quite the figure we know. He is not consistently noble. He is not always charitable. He is sometimes simply aggressively anti-authoritarian, which is relatable in any era, but is not quite the same thing as a principled redistributor of wealth. He is rougher in those early versions, more ambiguous, more interesting perhaps than the polished folk hero he eventually became. The edges have been smoothed by centuries of retelling, each generation filing away the parts that did not serve its purposes and polishing the parts that did. But here is the detail that the archive finds most compelling. Robin Hood may not have been a name at all in the way we understand names. In medieval legal records, variations of the name appear attached to different individuals in different regions across different time periods. Robin Hood, Roberhood, variations on that theme appear in court documents as apparent nicknames or descriptors applied to people who had gone outside the law, who had fled into forests or wild spaces, who existed at the margins of the legal order. The name may have functioned less like a proper noun and more like a common noun, less like a specific person's identity and more like a category, something like the local forest dwelling problem, or perhaps something closer to a type, the way we might speak of a certain kind of person without meaning any single individual. If this interpretation is correct, and many historians find it persuasive, then Robin Hood did not begin as a historical figure who was later mythologized. He began as a mythological type that was later given historical clothing. The ballads assembled a character from the raw material of many different stories, many different outlaws, many different grievances, and shaped that assemblage into something that felt specific, felt personal, felt like one man with one name and one green coat and one legendary aim. And the reason that process worked, the reason it produced something so durable, is that the figure it produced was not really about any particular person. It was about a particular need. Medieval peasants living under systems of taxation and feudal obligation that could be genuinely crushing needed something that the historical record was not providing. They needed evidence that the powerful could be humiliated, that the corrupt could be outwitted, that somewhere in the world, someone was balancing the scales on their behalf. They needed, in other words, not a real Robin Hood, but the idea of one, the possibility of one, the story of one. And stories, it turns out, are considerably easier to manufacture than actual outlaws with actual redistributive programs. Real outlaws were captured, tried, and hanged. Legends kept shooting arrows long after the men who might have inspired them were dust. There is something in this that speaks to a very deep human need. The need to believe that injustice does not go entirely unanswered. That somewhere in the system there is a crack through which the powerless can slip and from which they can strike back. Robin Hood gave that need a face and a name and a forest and a merry band of companions. And once a need that fundamental has a story attached to it, the story becomes almost impossible to dislodge, because arguing against it feels like arguing against the need itself. You are not debunking a legend. You are telling people that the justice they imagined was never coming. And that is a different kind of conversation entirely. We move now from English forests to something considerably more geographically ambitious. From a local outlaw to a global king. From Sherwood to somewhere beyond the edges of the known world. A place that kept moving every time anyone got close enough to check. We move toward one of the most extraordinary political fictions in medieval history. A figure whose legend influenced diplomacy, shaped exploration, and offered comfort to an entire civilization feeling the pressure of a world it did not fully understand. His name was Prester John. According to the legend, which began circulating seriously in the 12th century, somewhere in the mysterious East, in a realm beyond the reach of ordinary geography, there existed a Christian king of incomprehensible wealth and power. His kingdom was filled with wonders. Rivers ran with precious stones. Exotic creatures roamed his lands. His armies were vast and disciplined and devoted. His cities were magnificent. And crucially, he was Christian. In a period when the Crusades were defining the political and spiritual landscape of Western Europe, when Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land were under sustained military pressure, the idea of a powerful Christian monarch somewhere to the east, a potential ally who could strike from the other direction, was not merely appealing. It was strategically intoxicating. It was the answer to a prayer that had not yet found its miracle. Letters allegedly written by Prester John himself circulated widely through Europe. They described his realm in lavish detail, naming wonders and listing riches with the specificity of an inventory. They were copied. They were translated into multiple languages. They were read by popes and kings and scholars and ordinary people who heard them recited in churches and courts. They were almost certainly entirely fabricated. But they were fabricated so skillfully, with such specific and enticing detail, that their fictional nature was not the primary thing people noticed about them. What they noticed was the hope they contained. And hope, in a time of military and spiritual crisis, was not a small thing. It was the thing. And the kingdom kept moving. This is perhaps the most telling detail of the entire legend. When the geography of India became too well known to sustain the fiction of a hidden Christian empire there, Prester John's realm migrated to Central Asia. When Central Asia became better mapped, it moved again, eventually settling in Ethiopia, which had the advantage of being genuinely Christian and genuinely difficult for most medieval Europeans to visit and verify. The legend had a remarkable capacity to relocate itself just ahead of the advancing edge of European geographical knowledge. It stayed always at the horizon, always just beyond the point where verification became possible. European leaders took the idea seriously enough to act on it. Envoys were dispatched to find Prester John's kingdom or establish contact with it. Explorers partially justified their journeys into unknown territories on the hope of finding this mythical ally. The legend was not merely a story people enjoyed. It was a story people organized resources around, made decisions based on, used to navigate the geopolitical anxieties of their moment. A fiction was shaping the behavior of actual states. An invented king was influencing the decisions of real ones. Prester John was almost certainly assembled from fragments of real information that had reached Europe through the distorting lens of distance and wishful thinking. There were genuine Christian communities in Asia. There were genuine kingdoms in East Africa with Christian traditions. Travelers' reports filtered through multiple translations and the interpretive frameworks of people who desperately wanted to hear particular things could have generated the raw material from which the legend was built. But the construction itself, the specific figure of the all-powerful Eastern Christian king, was a product of European need rather than Eastern reality. And this is the thing the archive wants you to hold for a moment. Europe needed an ally it did not have, so Europe invented one. Not through simple credulity, not through mere wishful thinking, but through a process of active narrative construction that produced something functional, something that could be cited in diplomatic correspondence, something that could motivate exploration, something that could provide comfort in moments of geopolitical despair. The fiction was not a failure of intelligence. It was an exercise of imagination in service of a real political and emotional need. The map had a gap, and into that gap, someone placed a king. Prester John never sent his armies to relieve the pressure on the Crusader states. His kingdom never materialized on any map that actual explorers produced. But his legend shaped the direction of exploration, influenced the expectations that travelers brought to their journeys, and provided centuries of reassurance to people who needed to believe that somewhere beyond the horizon, help was waiting. That is an extraordinary achievement for someone who almost certainly never existed. Now let us move from the political to the literary, from invented monarchs to invented supernatural figures, and consider what it means when a fictional character becomes so embedded in a tradition that already blurs the line between history and legend that people begin to wonder whether he, too, might have been real. The Green Knight. If you know the 14th century poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, You know the scene. A figure rides into the hall of King Arthur's court during a Christmas feast. He is enormous. He is clad entirely in green. His horse is green. His hair and beard are green. He is carrying a great axe and a holly branch, which is an interesting combination that tells you immediately this is not a naturalistic figure, but a symbolic one. He proposes a game. One knight may strike him with the axe. In 1 year, he will deliver the same blow in return. Gawain accepts. He beheads the Green Knight. The Green Knight picks up his severed head. The head reminds Gawain of their appointment, and the Green Knight rides away, headless body and all, with a composure that suggests he has done this sort of thing before. The hall falls silent. The court of Camelot, that pinnacle of chivalric civilization, does not quite know what to do with what it has just witnessed. Now, no serious historian believes the Green Knight was a historical figure. He is a literary creation, a carefully constructed symbol operating within a tradition of Arthurian romance. He is green because green carries associations with the natural world, with wildness, with forces that exist outside the ordering structures of Christian civilization. He survives decapitation because he is not subject to ordinary mortal rules. He is testing Gawain not as an enemy, but as a kind of moral examiner, probing the limits of the knight's courage and honesty and integrity under conditions of genuine fear. The poem knows exactly what it is doing. Every detail is chosen. Every colour is deliberate. But here is the fascinating complication. The poem exists within the Arthurian tradition, and the Arthurian tradition occupied a peculiar space in medieval imagination, somewhere between acknowledged fiction and quasi-history. Geoffrey of Monmouth had presented Arthur as historical. Later writers had elaborated on that history. By the 14th century, Arthurian stories had accumulated enough institutional weight that they carried a kind of semi-historical aura, even when their content was clearly fantastic. Arthur's court felt real in some sense that was difficult to articulate precisely. Its knights felt real. The moral world they inhabited felt real. So when the Green Knight rides into that court, he is not entering a space that is clearly marked as fiction. He is entering a space that hovers between story and history, between imagination and memory. And in that liminal space, the supernatural becomes not impossible, but legendary. Strange, yes. Miraculous, certainly, but not necessarily untrue in the way that a story set in a clearly invented world would be untrue. Medieval audiences did not always draw the line between history and legend where we would draw it. If a story was morally true, if it illuminated something real about courage or temptation or the nature of honor, that moral truth had weight that was not entirely separate from factual truth. The Green Knight was never meant to be historical, but he was meant to be real in the ways that mattered. And in a tradition that already treated a probably fictional king as a historical figure, a supernatural challenger to that king's court was not automatically impossible. It was legendary, and legend in the medieval world carried a weight very close to fact. He never walked through an actual castle hall, but he still does in the poem, and in the imagination of everyone who has ever read it and felt, just for a moment, that the sound of hooves on a stone floor and the flash of a great axe in firelight was something more than fiction. That feeling is not a mistake. It is the poem working exactly as intended, from the literary to the devotional. From the Green Knight's allegorical forest to the crowded, miraculous, numerically extravagant world of medieval hagiography, the lives of the saints. Because the medieval church produced saints with a generosity and a creativity that modern institutional processes have largely abandoned, and some of those saints were built on foundations that the historical record finds difficult to support. Among the most spectacular examples is Saint Ursula. According to the legend in its fullest form, Ursula was a British princess of exceptional piety and exceptional organizational ability. She led a pilgrimage across Europe accompanied by 11,000 virgin companions. 11,000, not 11, not 100, not even 1,000. 11,000 young women traveling by sea, navigating storms, crossing the continent, eventually arriving at Cologne, where they were martyred by invading forces who objected to their faith, their virtue, or possibly their sheer logistical audacity. The number is so large that it becomes its own kind of argument. 11,000 pilgrims traveling together in the medieval period would have constituted one of the largest organized movements of people in European history. The shipping alone would have required a fleet of considerable size. The provisioning would have been a logistical challenge that would have left traces in the historical record. The arrival of 11,000 women in any medieval city would have been an event of such magnitude that contemporary chroniclers would have had difficulty ignoring it. None of these traces exist. The silence of the historical record is in this case almost comically complete. The earliest versions of the Ursula story are considerably more modest. A small group of Christian women, a martyrdom in the Cologne region. The specific details vague, the numbers small. Over time, as the story was retold and elaborated, the numbers grew. Because if you are telling a martyrdom story, if you are trying to convey the scale of devotion and sacrifice, subtlety is not your most useful tool. More companions means more faith. More witnesses means more significance. The legend grew to match the spiritual weight it was being asked to carry. It inflated to the size of its purpose. Many historians believe the specific number 11,000 may have originated from a misreading of a Latin inscription. The abbreviation for the name undecimilla, which was possibly a single person's name, may have been misread as undecimilia, 11,000, a copyist's error, a misread abbreviation. And from that small textual accident, 11,000 women entered the historical imagination of medieval Europe. From a single name, a multitude. From one letter misread, a procession that would stretch for miles. Once the larger number appeared, it became self-reinforcing. Relics multiplied to match the scale of the legend. Churches were dedicated. Artworks depicted vast crowds of identical figures standing solemnly in the background behind Ursula herself, their faces serene, their numbers impossible to count. The city of Cologne embraced the story with particular enthusiasm because martyrdom on that scale is excellent for a city's spiritual prestige, excellent for pilgrimage traffic, excellent for the kind of religious significance that draws resources and attention and devotion. The legend and the city grew together, each sustaining the other. Was there perhaps a small group of Christian women martyred in the Cologne region? Possibly. The kernel of historical reality at the center of the legend may be genuine, even if it is tiny. But the 11,000 companions the Grand Pilgrimage, the international fleet, the Princess of Britain at the centre of it all? Almost certainly not. What we have is a small truth that was dressed in magnificent and impossible clothing, because the clothing was what the moment required. And yet the story served its purposes. It honoured the value of faith maintained under mortal threat. It celebrated feminine virtue and courage in terms that the medieval church could endorse and promote. It elevated a city's spiritual importance. It gave pilgrims a destination and a narrative. It gave artists extraordinary subject matter, and they rose to the occasion with paintings and altarpieces of breathtaking beauty that now hang in museums across Europe. Their 11,000 figures rendered with a care and devotion that is itself a kind of truth, even if the event they depict never occurred. And it gave ordinary believers a story about sacrifice on a scale that made individual sacrifice feel both more meaningful and more possible. In the medieval devotional imagination, the size of the miracle was part of its meaning. 11,000 was not an error to be corrected. It was a statement about the magnitude of faith. And once a number becomes spiritually symbolic, arguing about its accuracy feels like missing the point entirely. The census was not the point. The martyrdom was the point. The faith was the point. The 11,000 were not a count. They were a declaration. Now we travel from the martyred multitudes of Cologne to the mountains of Switzerland, to a story that involves a crossbow, an apple, a child, and a tyrant whose hat apparently required more respect than he did. We arrive at William Tell, the Swiss folk hero who refused to bow to the hat of a Habsburg governor named Gessler, which was mounted on a pole in the town square as a symbol of Austrian authority and required to be saluted by all who passed. William Tell passed without saluting. He was arrested, and as punishment, he was ordered to shoot an apple from the head of his own son with his crossbow, which is either the most theatrical form of punitive justice ever devised, or a demonstration that medieval authoritarianism sometimes had a very particular flair for the dramatic. According to the legend, Tell calmly prepared, aimed, and split the apple cleanly. When Gessler noticed that Tell had prepared a second bolt, he asked why. Tell replied that if he had struck his son, the second bolt would have been for Gessler. He was imprisoned. He escaped. He eventually killed Gessler from ambush, and he became a symbol of Swiss resistance to tyranny, of the ordinary person's capacity to defy illegitimate authority, of the courage that lives in people who are pushed past the point of compliance. The story has the clean moral geometry of a parable, every element in its right place, every consequence following from every choice with the satisfying logic of justice being done. The story is told with the specificity of history. It has names. It has a location. It has a date range. It has the kind of concrete detail that feels like documentation. And it has been foundational to Swiss national identity for centuries. William Tell appears in Friedrich Schiller's famous play. He appears on monuments and in school books and in the cultural self-understanding of a nation that has organized significant parts of its self-image around the values his story embodies. He almost certainly never existed. The earliest written sources for the Tell legend date to the late 15th century, well after the period the story is set in. More troublingly, the core narrative, the apple shooting test of marksmanship, appears in very similar forms in Scandinavian legend, in Danish folklore, in other European traditions that have no obvious connection to Switzerland. The story of a skilled archer forced to demonstrate his ability by shooting a target placed on a loved one appears to be a widespread folk narrative type, not a unique historical event. The same story, with different names and different settings, surfaces across a remarkable geographic range. The motif was travelling. It was looking for a home, and it found one in the mountains of Switzerland, where it fitted perfectly with the story a people needed to tell about themselves. This does not mean the story was simply stolen or plagiarized. It means it was the kind of story that medieval and early modern cultures found deeply meaningful, deeply resonant, and therefore worth attaching to local heroes and local struggles. When Swiss communities needed a founding myth, a story that captured the spirit of resistance to external domination that they understood as central to their identity, the Tell narrative was available. It was compelling. It was emotionally precise. It said exactly what needed to be said about who the Swiss were and what they valued. The historical record of Swiss resistance to Habsburg authority is real. The political struggles that the Tell legend dramatizes were genuine. What was invented was the specific man, the specific apple, the specific crossbow bolt. The vessel was fictional. What it carried was true. And this is perhaps the most sophisticated thing that medieval and early modern cultures did with their invented figures. They did not simply make things up. They found stories that were true in the ways that mattered. Stories that captured real experiences, real values, real struggles, and they gave those stories bodies. They gave them names and faces and specific dramatic moments. They made the abstract concrete. They made the collective individual. They turned a community's self-understanding into a single man with a crossbow and a son and an apple and a tyrant who needed to be defied. William Tell never lived, but the courage he represents was real. The resistance he symbolizes was real. The need for a story like his was absolutely real. And in a world where real history is often too complicated, too ambiguous, too full of compromises and failures to serve as a clean moral example, a perfectly constructed legend can do work that no actual historical figure could manage. Real people are messy. Legends are precise. Let us pause here for a moment and let the patterns settle. Because we have been moving through individual cases, individual figures, and it would be easy to treat each one as a separate curiosity. A papal scandal here, a legendary king there, an outlaw, a global monarch, a supernatural knight, a martyred princess, a Swiss archer. But the archive is suggesting something more coherent than a collection of separate fabrications. It is suggesting a pattern, a practice, a particular relationship between the medieval world and the stories it told about itself. Consider what all of these figures have in common. They are not random inventions. They are not mistakes. Each one fills a specific gap, answers a specific need, resolves a specific anxiety, or expresses a specific aspiration that the historical record was failing to address. Pope Joan gave critics of the Church a perfect vehicle for their critique. Arthur gave a fragmented post-Roman Britain a vision of what unified, virtuous kingship might look like. Robin Hood gave the oppressed a fantasy of resistance and redistribution. Prester John gave a beleaguered Christendom a story about help that was coming. The Green Knight gave a sophisticated literary culture a way to explore moral complexity through supernatural allegory. Saint Ursula gave the Church a story about faith on a scale that matched its grandest ambitions. William Tell gave a people a founding myth that captured their self-understanding with perfect clarity. None of these are accidents. None of them are simple errors that credulous people failed to correct. They are, in their different ways, extraordinarily functional creations. They were built to do specific things, and they did those things with remarkable efficiency. The fact that they were not historically real in the way their audiences sometimes believe them to be does not diminish their function. In many cases, it enhanced it. A real pope who happened to be a woman would have been a scandal, and then a historical footnote. A legendary pope who might have been a woman became a perpetual critique of institutional pretension. A real post-Roman military leader named Arthur would have been a minor figure in a confusing period. The legendary Arthur became a moral universe that shaped civilization. The medieval world understood something about stories that we sometimes forget in our own era of fact-checking and verification. It understood that the stories a culture tells about itself are not merely decorative, they are constitutive. They help make the culture what it is. They give it its values, its heroes, its sense of what is possible and what is worth fighting for. And if the historical record does not provide the right stories, the ones that capture what the culture needs to understand about itself, then the culture will make them. Not out of ignorance, out of necessity, out of the deep human understanding that a people without stories is a people without a self. This is not an endorsement of fabrication. The archive is not suggesting that truth does not matter. It is suggesting something more nuanced. It is suggesting that we pay attention to what kinds of stories a culture chooses to invent, because those inventions reveal something about the culture's deepest needs and anxieties and aspirations that the factual record sometimes cannot. The gap between what happened and what people believed happened is not just an error to be corrected. It is a document. It tells us what people needed to be true, and that need is itself a historical fact of considerable importance. There is another layer to this that the archive wants to explore, because we have been speaking mostly about figures that were created by medieval culture for medieval purposes. But many of these figures did not stay in the Middle Ages. They were carried forward. They were adapted, reimagined, given new contexts, new meanings, new political functions in periods long after the medieval world had ended. And that survival tells us something important about what these inventions actually were. Arthur became a tool of Tudor legitimacy. He became a symbol of British nationalism. He became a framework for Victorian ideals of chivalry and moral order. He became, in the 20th century, a vehicle for exploring questions about leadership and failure and the gap between ideal and reality. Each era found in Arthur what it needed to find. The legend was flexible enough to serve radically different purposes across radically different historical moments. That flexibility is not a weakness of the myth. It is its greatest strength. A story that can mean different things to different people in different circumstances without losing its essential coherence is a story with extraordinary staying power. It is a vessel large enough to carry whatever each age needs to put inside it. Robin Hood underwent similar transformations. The rough, ambiguous outlaw of the early ballads became increasingly noble, increasingly principled, increasingly specifically targeted in his redistribution as the centuries passed. He acquired a specific historical setting, a specific king to contrast with the corrupt sheriff, a specific romantic attachment in Maid Marian. Each edition made him more useful for the purposes of whoever was telling the story at that moment. He became a vehicle for critiques of aristocratic privilege in one era, a symbol of English national character in another, a straightforwardly romantic hero in another. The core remained recognizable, the applications multiplied. The legend was not frozen in time, it was alive, growing, adapting, finding new relevance in every new century that needed it. Prester John's legend shaped the expectations that explorers brought to their journeys. When Vasco da Gama rounded Africa and made contact with the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, there were people who believed, or at least hoped, that they had finally found Prester John's realm. The legend had survived long enough to be applied to actual geopolitical reality, to shape how Europeans interpreted what they were finding as they expanded their geographic knowledge. A fiction from the 12th century was still influencing interpretation in the 15th. That is a remarkable lifespan for an invented figure. It had outlasted the specific crisis that created it and found new purpose in a new age of discovery. And William Tell became, in the 19th century, one of the founding myths of Swiss national identity at precisely the moment when that identity needed to be articulated and consolidated. Schiller's play, written in 1804, turned the medieval legend into a vehicle for Romantic-era ideas about freedom, resistance, and the relationship between the individual and tyrannical authority. The story that had been circulating in various forms for centuries was given its definitive artistic shape at exactly the historical moment when it was most needed. The invention had been waiting, it seems, for the right moment to become fully itself. Legends are patient in a way that facts cannot afford to be. This is what the archive finds most extraordinary about these figures. They were not simply created and then believed. They were created, believed, forgotten, rediscovered, reinterpreted, and redeployed across centuries in ways that their original inventors could not have anticipated. They proved to be more durable than most actual historical figures precisely because they were not anchored to the accidents and limitations of actual historical existence. They could be whatever each era needed them to be. They could carry whatever weight was placed on them. They were, in a sense, not figures at all, but vessels, containers for meaning that could be refilled again and again without losing their shape. And perhaps this is the deepest thing the archive has to offer tonight. Not simply that the Middle Ages invented figures and believed in them, but that the figures they invented proved so well constructed, so precisely calibrated to human needs that persist across centuries, that we are still living with them. We still know Arthur. We still know Robin Hood. We still know Pope Joan, even if we know her as a legend rather than a historical figure. We still know Tell, still know Ursula, still know the Green Knight. These inventions outlasted the civilization that created them. They outlasted the specific needs they were designed to address. They became part of the permanent furniture of Western imagination. What does it mean that the stories a culture invents to fill its gaps, to answer its needs, to express its aspirations, can prove more durable than the actual history of that culture? What does it mean that we remember the legendary Arthur more vividly than we remember most actual kings of the same period? That we know Robin Hood more intimately than we know most genuine medieval outlaws? That Pope Joan, who never existed, is more present in our imagination of the medieval church than most popes who actually governed it? It means perhaps that we have been misunderstanding what history is for. We tend to think of history as a record of what happened, and it is that. But it is also a record of what people needed to believe had happened, of what they needed to be true, of what they could not find in the factual record and therefore had to construct. And those constructions, those inventions, those carefully crafted legends are not failures of history. They are history. They are evidence of the deepest kind, evidence not of events, but of needs, not of facts, but of human beings in all their complexity, reaching for stories that could make sense of their world and their place in it. The medieval period was, in this sense, not uniquely credulous. It was uniquely honest about what it was doing, or perhaps not honest exactly, since many people genuinely believed in these figures, but transparent, in retrospect, about the process. The gap between the historical evidence and the legend is so large in many of these cases that we can see the construction clearly. We can see where the story was built, where it was embellished, where it migrated to serve new purposes. We can see the architecture of the invention. We can walk through the rooms of it and understand why each one was built. Our own era does the same thing. We build legends around figures who existed, but whose existence we have simplified and mythologized beyond recognition. We create founding myths that serve national purposes. We tell stories about ourselves that are true in the ways that matter and adjusted in the ways that are convenient. The difference is not that we have stopped inventing. The difference is that we are less comfortable acknowledging that we do it. We have the tools to check, and so we feel we should, and so we feel embarrassed when we discover we have not. The medieval world had fewer such tools, and perhaps, in consequence, less such embarrassment. It wore its need for stories more openly. The medieval world, with its different relationship to the boundary between history and story, between fact and meaning, was in some ways more honest about the fundamental human activity of narrative construction. It was more willing to let a good story be a good story, to let a useful legend be a useful legend, without insisting that every story also be a documented fact. That willingness produced some extraordinary fabrications. It also produced some extraordinary art, some extraordinary political philosophy, some extraordinary expressions of human aspiration. The cost and the gift were inseparable. Let the thought drift for a moment. Let it settle into the quiet. The All Archive is not asking you to decide whether the medieval world was right or wrong in its relationship to truth. It is asking you to notice something, to notice that the stories we tell about history, including the stories we tell about which medieval figures were real and which were invented, are themselves a kind of construction, a kind of selection. We choose which parts of the past to preserve and which to let fade. We choose which stories to carry forward and which to leave behind. And in making those choices, we are doing something not entirely different from what the medieval chroniclers were doing when they repeated the story of Pope Joan or elaborated the legend of Arthur. We are deciding what needs to be true, what needs to be remembered, what the past should mean for the present, and that decision is never purely factual. It is always, in part, an act of construction, an act of imagination in service of need. The archive is one such act. These words, spoken in the dark, are one such act. The choice to sit with these questions rather than dismiss them is one such act. We are all, in our way, still doing what the medieval world did. We are still building the stories we need. The archive does not find this troubling. It finds it fascinating. It finds it deeply, essentially human. The impulse to make meaning, to fill gaps, to build figures who embody values and answer needs is not a failure of intelligence. It is one of the most remarkable things that human beings do. The medieval world did it with particular energy and particular creativity and particular lack of embarrassment. And the figures it produced have proven in many cases more enduring than most of what we would call solid historical fact. Pope Joan never sat on the throne of St. Peter, but she sat on the throne of medieval imagination for centuries, and she still sits there, still asking her questions about power and gender and institutional pretension. Arthur never pulled a sword from a stone, but he has been pulling at the imagination of Western civilization for 1,000 years, still asking his questions about what leadership should be and what happens when ideals meet reality. Robin Hood never robbed a single rich man to give to a single poor one, but he has been robbing the imagination of every era that needed a story about justice from the outside, and he keeps the arrows flying. These are not failures, these are achievements, strange, complicated, morally ambiguous achievements that require us to think carefully about what we mean when we say something is real. But achievements nonetheless, achievements that have outlasted cathedrals, outlasted dynasties, outlasted the very languages in which they were first told. And as you lie in the dark tonight, as the weight of the day releases and the mind begins its slow drift towards sleep, perhaps the thought that can accompany you into that drift is this: the stories that last are not always the ones that happened. They are the ones that needed to happen, the ones that expressed something so true about human experience that they refuse to stay contained within the boundaries of any single life or any single era. They escaped into the collective imagination, and they have been living there ever since, gathering meaning the way old buildings gather moss, slowly, steadily, becoming more themselves with every passing year. The Middle Ages did not simply make things up. They made things that were needed, and some of what they made proved so necessary, so precisely fitted to something permanent in human experience that it has outlasted everything else they built. The cathedrals still stand, some of them. The manuscripts survive, some of them. But Arthur and Robin Hood and Joan and Tell and Ursula and the Green Knight, they are still here, still being told, still being argued about, still doing the work they were made to do, still filling the gaps that history leaves open. The archive closes this particular drawer gently, not because the questions are answered. They are not. They may never be. But because there is a kind of peace available in sitting with unanswered questions, in letting the mystery of why human beings need the stories they need rest quietly, alongside the mystery of whether those stories were ever true. Both mysteries are real, both are worth holding, and holding them together without forcing a resolution is perhaps the most honest thing we can do. The medieval world is gone, but it left us its legends, and the legends, it turns out, were the most durable thing it had. More durable than its politics, more durable than its theology, more durable than its social structures or its economic systems or its military arrangements. The stories survived everything. They always do. And in that survival is something worth knowing about what we are, about what we need, about what we cannot seem to live without. If this is the kind of night where sleep is still some distance away, consider sending this to someone who also finds themselves drawn to the hours when history gets strange. There is something quietly meaningful about passing these hidden stories forward, about two people in different places holding the same questions in the dark. That small act keeps these forgotten corners of the past alive in exactly the way the archive hopes they will be kept. And if you have listened once already and found your mind still turning, let it play again. The layers have a way of revealing themselves differently the second time through. Let that be the last thought before sleep takes you. The stories survived everything. They always do. And somewhere in that survival is something worth knowing about what we are, about what we need, about what we cannot seem to live without. The archive will be here when you return. The files will be waiting. And the night, as always, holds more than the day has time to tell. The archive has one more door to point you toward before you rest. The episode on what happened in 1137 BC, when nearly every civilization on Earth collapsed at once, sits close to this one in spirit. It asks the same quiet question from a different angle. What happens to the stories people tell about themselves when everything else disappears? That one is waiting for you whenever the night calls you back.